You know what time it is? Gotcha! Get into it! Get into it! Yes! We're back! We're back with Storytime with Chris. As I always say, you don't have to watch these videos when they go live. You're more than welcome to watch them in your downtime, nap time, max relaxer, chillaxing time, in between time, mean time, scheme time, story time, break time, CP time. Anytime that you want to hear a highly animated voice bring you wonderful stories of magic, fantasy, science fiction, adventure, and many, many more in between. Hello, lovelies, on my favorite day of the week. I'm a little drained, not ill, just tired. I had a bit of a thought-provoking therapy session today. For those who don't know, I take therapy virtually every Wednesday at 10. I think it's important to talk about mental health. It's okay to see a therapist, a psychiatrist, or talk to a counselor in order to seek further wisdom about your situation. And there's nothing wrong with that. We supporting our mental health in this household, on this channel. So just a little bit drained, but that doesn't mean that I am not going to give you my all for this final chapter of Oversea and Understone. We literally were able to finish the first book of the Darkest Rising sequence in a matter of weeks, which I really love, on top of the fact that I was doing double the chapters, which I think I'm going to start doing that from time to time, do 2 chapters every so often. But enough of my blather, you came to hear a story. There we go. And no, I don't own the music that you're listening to in the background. Alrighty. Let's go ahead and begin. Chapter 14. Barney blinked at the darkness. As his eyes grew accustomed to being out of the sunlight, vague objects took shape in the dark. He realized that the light from the entrance penetrated further inside than they had realized, and for the first few yards, at least he could see the faint shine of the slimy green weed covering the walls and roof of the cave, and the glint of water lying along the bottom in a shallow, unmoving stream. He moved warily forward, one hand up touching the roof and the other stretched to one side. He could feel a slight, steady pull on the line round his waist from Simon, holding it behind him. Very loud in the enclosed silence of the cave, he could hear the splash of their feet through the water and his brother breathing. "Go carefully," Simon said behind him. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper, but the cave echoed in a husking mutter that filled the space all around them. "I am. You might bump your head." "You might bump yours. Mind this bit here. It goes down lower. Put your hand on the roof and you'll feel it." "I can," Simon said fervently. His neck was bent uncomfortably downwards. Taller than Barney, he had to stoop slightly all the way to avoid hitting his head on the slimy rock above. Occasionally, a large, cold drop of water dripped down inside his shirt collar. "Isn't it cold?" "Freezing!" Barney's shorts were clinging clammily to the tops of his legs, and he felt the air chill through his shirt. He was finding it more and more difficult to make out any shapes around him, and soon he paused uneasily, feeling the darkness close in as if it were pressing on his eyes. Groping upwards, his fingers could no longer feel the roof. Ahead of him, it rose out of reach, and he clutched at air. "Wait a minute, Simon." His voice came eerily back at him from all sides. "I think it gets higher here, but I can't see a thing now. Have you got those matches?" Simon felt his way along the line to where Barney stood. He touched his shoulder, and Barney felt more comforted at the contact than he would have admitted even to himself. "Don't move. I'm letting go of the line for a minute." Simon groped into his pocket for the matches and opened the box, feeling the edges carefully to make sure he had it the right way up. The first 2 matches grated obstinately on the box as he tried to strike them, and nothing happened. The third flared up but broke as if it did so, burning Simon's fingers, so they dropped it with an exclamation before they could blink away the dazzle of the sudden light. There was a small hiss as it dropped into the water around their feet. Buck up, said Barney. I'm going as fast as I can. That's it. The fourth match was dried and rasped into flame, flickering. Simon cupped his hand to shelter it. Funny, there must be a draft in here. I can't feel one. The match can. That's good. It means there must be an opening somewhere at the other end. So it is the right cave after all. Simon's hand hid the dazzle of the little flame, and Barney peered hastily around in the wavering light. Their shadows danced huge and grotesque on the wall, one of my favorite words. He looked up and took a few careful steps forward. Hold it up. Hey, come on, the roof does go up higher here. You'll be able to stand upright. Simon stepped cautiously towards him, bent over the match, and straightened his back with a gasp of relief. Then the match burned his fingers and he dropped it, and once the darkness wrapped them like a blanket again. Hang on, I'll light another one. Well, wait a minute, we don't want to waste them. I could see a bit of the way ahead when it went out, so we can go that far before you light the next. Barney shut his eyes. Somehow, even though the cave was just as dark, when his eyes were open, he found shutting them gave him a sense of being safer. Still touching the slippery wall with his fingertips, he moved 2 or 3 paces forward. Simon followed him with one hand on his shoulder, staring ahead into the darkness, but seeing as little as if a thick black curtain were hanging close before his eyes. They went on into the cave for what seemed a long time. Every few moments, Simon struck a match and they moved forward while the dim light lasted, and for the few remembered paces after it flickered out. Once they tried to light the candle stump, but it only sputtered obstinately, so Simon put it back in his pocket. The air was cold but fresh on their faces, although there was a smell around them of salt and seaweed as if they were under the sea. It was not difficult to breathe. The silence, like the darkness, seemed almost solid, broken only by their own footsteps, and an occasional musical plop as water somewhere dripped from the roof of the cave. As Simon was standing still, fumbling into the matchbox again, Barney felt the line round his waist jerk tight and dig into him. Once, twice. There's 2 pulls on the line. It must be Jane. 10 minutes. Gosh, I thought we'd been in here for hours. I'll signal back, Simon said. He struck a match and saw the line thin and taut in its light. Taking firm hold of it, he gave 2 slow, steady pulls in the direction from which they had come. Funny to think of Jane on the other end, Barney said. I wonder how much there is left. Gosh, do you think we should run out? How much line was there? Quite a lot, said Simon, more optimistically than he felt. We've been going awfully slowly. Ow! The match burned down to his fingers and he dropped it hastily. There was no hiss as it fell. As they moved, groping, Simon suddenly realized they had been listening for the noise. Stop a tick, Barney. He scuffed at the ground with one foot and peered down. The floor is not wet anymore. My shoes still squelch, Simon said. That's the water inside them, idiot, not outside. Simon's voice boomed hollowly round the cave, and he hastily dropped to a whisper again, half afraid that the noise might bring the roof down on them. The sides aren't slimy here either, Barney said suddenly. It's dry rock. It's been here for quite some time, actually. Only I hadn't really taken any notice. Another match fizzed alight as Simon held it to the one dying in his fingers. He held the flame close to the wall. They saw bare gray granite, veined here and there, a white sparkling rock and no seaweed. The ground, when Barney stopped to touch it, was covered with a kind of dusty sand. We must be going uphill. The sea can't ever come in this far, but we heard it booming about from up the top this morning. Does that mean we've come past the opening of the chimney bit? Barney craned his neck back to look at the roof. I don't think so, Simon said uncertainly. The noise would carry a long way. Hey, look ahead, quick. This match is going out. Barney peered forward at the now familiar picture that he was never afterwards to forget. Of narrow shadow-swung walls tunneling into the dark, holding them in a cramped, unfriendly grip. And in the second before the darkness came down on them again, he thought he saw the curtain of shadow at the end nearer than it had been before. He moved hastily forward, and then some instinct told him to stop. He put out his hand in the silent darkness. It met solid rock a few inches from his face. Simon, it's a dead end. What? Incredulity and disappointment rose in Simon's voice. He struggled with the matches. He could feel the bottom of the box through them now, and realized that there could not be many left. At the flickering light, it was difficult to tell shadow from darkness, but they saw that the cave had not actually come to an end. Instead, it was changed just in front of them to a far narrower passage, tall and thin, with a great boulder wedged between its side about 3 feet above the ground. Above their heads, out of reach, the cleft was open to the roof, but there was no way of climbing up to it. The boulder blocked their path. "We'll never get through that," Simon said in despair. "There must have been a fall of rock since the Cornishman went through." Barney looked down at the forbidding dark gap that remained at the bottom of the cleft, jagged and sinister through the dancing shadows, and swallowed. He was beginning to wish very much that they were back in the sunlight again. Then he thought of the Grail, then of Mr. Hastings' face. "I can get through underneath if I crawl." "No," Simon said at once. "It's dangerous." "We can't go back now." Barney gained confidence as he began to argue. "We've got this far. We may be just a few feet away from it. I'll come out again if it's too narrow." "Oh, come on, Simon, let me try." The match went out. "We haven't got many left," Simon said out of the darkness. "They'll run out soon. We'll just have to make that candle light or we shall be stuck in the dark. Where are you?" Groping his way along the line towards Barney, he took his hand and put the matchbox into it. Then he felt in his own pocket for the stub of candle, rubbing its wick hopefully on his shirt to dry it. "Now light one of the matches." There was a noise behind them in the darkness, like a stone falling, a grating, rattling noise, and then silence again. What was that? They listened nervously. He could hear only the sudden violent thumping of their own hearts. Barney struck a match, his hand shaking. The cave sprang into light again around them, with only the darkness pressing mockingly from the direction of the noise. "It wasn't anything," Simon said at last. "Just a stone we must have brushed loose. Here." He held the candlestick to the flame. The match burned right down, but still the candle wick only sputtered as if it had before. They tried again, holding their breath, and this time the wick caught and burned with a long, smoking yellow flame. "Hold these," Barney said with determination. "I'm going in there." He gave Simon back the last few loose matches and took the candle. "Look," he said, shielding the smoking flame from the draught, with his other hand. "It's not so low, really. I can go on my hands and knees." Simon peered at the entrance unhappily. "Well, for goodness sake, be careful, and pull at the light if you get stuck. I'll keep hold of it." Barney went down on his hands and knees and crawled into the dark opening beneath the wedged rock, holding the dangerously flickering candle in front of him. The draught seemed to be stronger now. The rock brushed his body on all sides so that he had to keep his head down and his elbows in. So he's kind of like this, kind of like crawling in this little space to try to get to the Grail. For a moment, he almost panicked with the sense of being shut in. But before the panic could take hold, the shadows looming around the one point of candle changed their shape, and he raised his head without hitting the rock. He crawled a little farther, the floor rough and gritty under his knees, and found not only that he could stand upright, but that the cave was much wider. The pool of light cast by his carefully guarded flame did not even show the walls on either side. "Are you all right?" Simon's anxious voice came muffled through the opening behind them. Barney bent down. "It's okay. It widens out again here. There must be an entrance. I'm going in." He felt the line as his waist tightened as Simon jerked an answer, and he set off slowly across the cave. The darkness opened before him in the small light from his inch of candle, already burning down and dripping hot wax over his fingernails. When he glanced back over his shoulder, he could no longer see the entrance from which he had come. "Hello?" Barney said tentatively into the darkness. His voice whispered back at him in a sinister, eerie way, not booming and reverberating round as if it had been in the narrow tunnel-like cave they had come through, but muttering far away, high in the air. Barney swung around in a circle, vainly peering into the dark. The space round him must be as big as a house, and yet he was in the depths of Kimar Head. He paused, irresolute. The candle was burning down, soft between his fingers. The thought of the towering dark man in his strange, empty house came back to him suddenly, and with all the feeling of menace that surrounded their pursuers, the enemy who so desperately wanted to keep them from finding the Grail, Barney shivered with fright and sudden cold. It was as if they were all around him in the silent darkness, evil and unseen, willing him to go back. His ears sang, even in the great empty space of the cave. He felt that something was pressing him down, calling him incessantly to turn away. "Who are you to intrude here?" the voice seemed to whisper. "One small boy prying into something that is so much bigger than you can understand, that has remained undisturbed for so many years? Go away, go back where you are safe. Leave such ancient things alone." But then Barney thought of Great Uncle Mary, whose mysterious quest they were following. He thought of all that he had said right in the beginning of the battle that was never won but never totally lost. And although he saw nothing but the shadows and the blackness all around his small, lonely pool of yellow light, he suddenly had a vivid picture of the knight Bedouin who had begun it all when he came fleeing to Cornwall from the east. In full armor, he stood in Barney's mind guarding the last trust of King Arthur, chased by the same forces that were now pursuing them. And Barney remembered the story that Bedouin was buried on Kimar Head, perhaps directly above the cave where he stood, and he was not frightened. There was friendliness round him in the dark now as well as fear. So Barney did not turn back. He went on sheltering his small tiny light into the dark that gave back in whispering echoes the sound of his own steps. And then above his head he became aware of a noise stranger than anything he had ever heard. It seemed to come from nowhere, out of the air, a husky, earthly humming, very faint and far away, yet filling the whole cave. It wavered up and down, high and then low, like the wind that sings in its trees and telegraph wires. As the thought flickered through Barney's mind, he held the candle up and saw that over his head the roof opened into a kind of chimney, rising up and out of sight. He thought for an instant they saw a point of light shining down, but his own light dazzled his eyes, and he could never be sure. And then he realized that the noise he could hear was the wind far above, blowing over the hole in the rocks that they had found that morning. The singing down in the cave was the singing of the wind over Kamar Head. It was almost by accident as he was looking out that he saw the ledge. It jutted out from the rocky side of the chimney at the edge of the cave, a bump of rock beneath the hollow, like a kind of natural cupboard just within his reach. Inside it he saw the glint of candlelight reflected back from a shape that was not part of the rock. Hardly daring to breathe, he reached up and found his hand touching the side of something smooth and curved. It rang beneath his fingernail with the sound of metal. He grasped it and took it down, blinking at the dust which rose from the ledge as he did so. It was a cup, heavy and strangely shaped, swelling out from a thick stem into a tall bell shape like the goblets he had seen pictured in his books about King Arthur. He wondered how the artist could have known. He could hardly believe that this, at last, must be the Grail. The metal was cold in his hand, dusty and very dirty, but with a dull golden sheen underneath the dirt. There was nothing else on the ledge. The candle flickered slowly, and suddenly the wax felt soft and warm, and Barney guessed with a shock that he'd be burned for only a few moments more before he'd be left alone in the dark. He turned away from the ledge to the direction from which he had come, and realized how lost he would have been without the line tied to his waist. The vast round chamber of the cave stretched out all around him into the dark. Only the line, straight and thin, told him the way to go. He walked towards it. The line dropped to the ground and then drew taut again. Simon must be pulling it in. Barney clutched the Grail to him with one hand and held up the candle, now almost burned away, with the other. Excitement bubbled away any of the fears he had felt before. "Simon!" he called. "I found it!" There was no answer but his own voice, whispering back at him from the empty cave. "Found it, found it, found it, found it." A dozen voices, each his own, from every side, and the light flickered and went out. The line stayed taut as Barney put his hand on it and walked slowly forward. "Simon?" he said uncertainly. Still, there was no answer. For a moment he saw in his mind a terrible picture of Simon overpowered and helpless, and on the other side of the narrow passage in the rock, the tall, sneering figure of Mr. Hastings, taking in the line as if he were playing a fish on a hook and waiting. Barney's throat felt suddenly dry. He held the Grail tighter to him in the darkness, and his heart thumping. Then he heard Simon's voice low down in the darkness before him and very muffled. "Barney? Barney?" Barney put out his hand and felt the rock where the roof dropped suddenly to the narrow part of the cave. "I'm here! Simon, I found it! I've got the Grail!" But all the muffled urgent voice said was, "Come on out, quick!" Barney went down on his hands and knees, wincing again at the pressure of the sharp edges of the rock. Carefully he crawled into the crevice that separated the two parts of the cave, bumping his head in the dark on the low, uneven roof. He held the Grail upright before him, but he knocked it against the side of the rock and rang out, to his surprise, with a long musical note as clear and true as a bell. He saw a dim glow lighting the farther end of the crack, and then the bright star of a match, and Simon crouching low and pulling in the line with his free hand. The shadows made his eyes look big and dark and alarmed. He stared at Barney, emerged, forgetting everything at the sight of the tall cup. Simon had been growing more and more anxious, and only the feel of Barney still moving on the other end of the line had stopped him from squeezing through the narrow gap himself. He had stood alone in the dark, straining for every sound, longing for light, but forcing himself to keep the 6 remaining matches in his pocket for the journey back. It had seemed a very long time. He took the cup from Barney's hands. I thought it would be a different shape, somehow. What's this inside? Where? Look! Simon felt inside the cup and brought out what looked first like a short stick, almost as dark with age as the cup itself. It had been wedged between the sides, and Barney had not seen it in his haste. It's very heavy. I think it's made of lead. What is it? A kind of tube, like the telescope case, only a lot smaller. It doesn't seem to unscrew, though. Perhaps it just fits together. Simon pulled experimentally at the tube, and suddenly end of it came off like a cap and wound in a roll. Inside, they saw something very familiar indeed. It's another manuscript! So that's what he meant when he said... Simon broke off. He had taken hold of one end of the rolled parchment in an attempt to pull it out of the tube, and the edge had crumbled away at his touch. With sudden caution, he jerked his hand away, and in the same instant remembered why he had called so anxiously for Barney to come out. We can't touch it. It's too old. And Barney, we've got to get out of here as quick as we can. Jane gave 3 pulls on the line just before you came back. The tide must be coming in. If we don't get out soon, we shall soon be cut off. As the boys disappeared into the mouth of the cave, Jane had settled herself to lean against the lone standing rock amongst the wet pillows of seaweed and the gray-green sweep of flat granite causeway round the cliff. She tucked this telescope case carefully under her arm. Even though she had always been with Simon when he was carrying it about, she felt a peculiar, unnerving sense of responsibility at the thought of what was inside. Gradually, she paid out the thin fishing line from the neatly wound wad in her hand. The pressure on it was uneven, as if inside the cave the boys were moving forward and then stopping every few moments. She had to concentrate to keep the line from either pulling too tight or drooping loose on the ground. It was very hot. The sun beat down over the towering gray cliff, and she felt the heat pricking along her skin. Even the rock she leaned on was baked by the sun, and she could feel the warmth of it through her shirt and on her back. Behind her, the water swished gently as if washed the edge of the uncovered rocks. There was no other sound anywhere. At the lonely foot of the headland, with the sea stretching all around, and without the line moving in his hands, Jane could have believed that she was the only person in the world. The land and the gray house seemed very far away. She wondered idly if their parents had come back from Penzance yet, and what they would think when they found the house completely empty with nothing to show where anyone had gone. She thought of the 3 figures they had seen striding out over Kamar Head, led by the frightening Mr. Hastings, black and long-legged like some giant insect. Instinctively, she looked up at the cliff. There was no sound, no movement, and only the gray sweep of rock that leant over her in permanent, unmoving menace, with a green cap of grass on the headland at the top, 200 feet above. And then Great Uncle Mary followed them into her mind. Where was he? Where he had gone this time? What so near the end of the quest could possibly have been important enough to take him away? Never for one moment did Jane think that he could have come to any harm or have been captured by the enemy. She remembered too clearly the utter confidence with which Great Uncle Mary had swept her into his arms on the midnight headland. They dare not follow if I am here. I wish you were here now, Jane said aloud, shivering a little in the spite of the hot, still air. She was not happy with Simon and Barney deep in a darkness where anything must be lurking, where they might get lost and never get out, where the roof might fall in. Great Uncle Mary would have made sure that nothing like that could happen. Jane looked at her watch. It was 12 minutes past 5, and still the line in her hands was moving slowly and irregularly into the cave. She gave 2 strong, deliberate tugs on the line. After a pause, she felt it move twice in reply, but faintly. The line was 2/3 unwound. She wished she had measured it as she let it go. Time dragged by. Still the line pulled incessantly out of her hand, moving into the dark entrance more slowly now. The sun blazed down, immovable out of the empty blue sky, and a small breeze sprang up from nowhere to lift the edges of Jane's long, loose hair. She leaned against the rock and left her senses drift, feeling the heat of the sun on her skin, breathing the sea smell of the wet rocks and seaweed, and listening to the gentle lap-lap of the sea. Then, in a kind of sleepy daze with only her fingers awake, she became aware that the sound of the sea had changed. She jerked to her feet and swung around. To her horror, the piles of seaweed nearest the sea were swaying up and down in a swell that had not been there before. Waves were washing over what had been the edge of the rocks nearer her. She thought then they had been. The tide was on the turn. Jane felt panic begin to rise within her. The last few loops of the line were loose in her hand now. The boys must have been in an alarming way inside the cave. She took firm hold of the line, winding part of the slack around her hand, and going up to the dark mouth of the cave and jerked it hard. 1, 2, 3. 3 times. Nothing happened. She waited, listening to the regular swash of the waves creeping in. Then just as tears of fright were beginning to prickle in her eyes, she felt the answering signal. 3 faint tugs on the line, pulling at her hand. Almost at once, the strain lessened, and the line began to fall slack. Jane let out a great breath of relief. The line came faster towards her. She pulled at it, slowly at first, and then more easily, faster. And then she had paid it out. Then at last, Simon and Barney, blinking at the daylight, behind hands raised to shield their eyes, came stumbling out of the narrow entrance of the cave. "Hello," Simon said foolishly, sounding dazed. His matches had run out 5 full minutes before they reached the light, and the last part of the way had been a nightmare journey in the pitch dark, walking blind and trusting to the feel of the line to tell them that the way ahead was clear. He had made Barney let him go first. All the time he had felt every next step might bring him crashing against rock, or face to face in the dark with some nameless thing, and he would not have been surprised when they emerged to find that all his hair had turned white. Jane only looked at him with a small, wry grin and said, as he had, "Hello." "Look," Barney said and held up the grail. Jane felt her grin widen with delight. "Then we've beaten them. We've got it. Gosh, I wish Gummery were here." "I think it's made of gold." Barney rubbed at the metal. Out in the sunlight, the grail seemed far less magical than in the mysterious darkness of the cave, but a bright yellow gleam showed here and there through the dirt on its side. "There's a sort of pattern scratching all over it, too," he said, "but you can't see it properly without cleaning it up. It's terribly ancient." "But what does it mean? I mean, everyone's trying like mad to get hold of it because it can tell them something. But when you look at it, there doesn't seem to be anything it could possibly tell anyone, unless the pattern's some sort of message." "The manuscript," Simon said. "Oh gosh, yes." Barney took the small, heavy lead tube from the cup and showed Jane the manuscript inside. "This was wedged in the grail. It must follow on from where our manuscript leaves off. I bet it's tremendously important. I bet it explains everything, but it breaks up almost as soon as you look at it." He carefully fitted the cap back on the tube. "We've got to get it home safely," Simon said. "I wonder if there's room." "Wait a minute." He took the telescope case from under Jane's arm and unscrewed it. Their own familiar manuscript stood up from the lower half, fitting it closely. Simon took the dark leaden cylinder and dropped it carefully inside the center of the parchment in the telescope case. "There. Got a hanky, Jane?" Jane took a handkerchief from her shirt pocket. "What for?" "Like that," Simon said, fitting the handkerchief in a tight ball inside the top of the parchment roll. "It'll keep the new one steady. We'll have to run if we're going to get off before the tide catches up with us, and it'll get bounced about a lot." Automatically, Jane and Barney turned to look again at the sea, and exactly the same moment each of them gasped. With the noise of pure strangled fright, Simon had bent his head to screw the 2 halves of the case back together. He looked up quickly. The waves were lifting the seaweed now within 6 feet of where they stood, but that was not what was wrong. Jane and Barney, arrested in mid-movement, were looking further out to sea. For a moment, the one jutting rock obscured Simon's view. Then he too saw the tall, sweeping lines of the yacht Lady Mary under full sail come round the end of the headland towards them, and he too saw the tall, dark figure standing in the bow with one arm raised, pointing. "Come on, quick!" He grabbed at Barney and Jane as they stood motionless with shock and pushed them ahead of him. They jumped and slithered over the seaweed-cushioned rocks away from the cave and the pursuing yacht. Barney clutched the grail in one hand as he ran, his arms outstretched to keep his balance, and Simon held the manuscripts in their case grimly to his chest. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great wide mainsails of the yacht crumpling down onto the deck, and a small dinghy being lowered over the side. Barney slipped and fell and nearly brought them both down on top of him. Even as he fell, the grail did not leave his grip, but struck the rock once more with the same clear bell-like note as before. It rang out over the sound of their splashing, hasty feet. He struggled up again, biting his lip at the sting of salt eating into the graze on his knee, and they hurried on. They were splashing through water all the while now. Their waves had grown and were washing right over the rocks with every pulse of the rising tide. The water massed with the swirling coat that would turn soon into a current strong enough to dislodge their quite desperate feet. Barney slipped away and fell with a splash. "Let me take it." "No!" He scrambled with a foothold. Jane pulled him up by his free arm, and the frenzied nightmare of a race drove them faster, zigzagging in wild, blind leaps over the wave-washed rocks. Simon glanced back again. 2 figures in a small dinghy were paddling fast towards them from the yacht. He heard the yacht's engines cough into life. "Go on, quick!" he gasped. "We can still do it!" They hastened on, half stumbling, kept on their feet only by their own speed. Yet there was no sight of the beach round the headland, but only the sea on one side and the great wall of the cliff rising on the other, and before them, dwindling into the tide, the long path of rocks and weed. "Stop!" A deep voice rang out across the water behind them. "Come back, you stupid children! Come here!" "They won't catch us," Simon panted, catching Barney as he almost fell a third time and jerking him back to his feet. Jane at his side was sobbing for breath at every step, but running and stumbling with the same desperate haste. Then round the headland in front of them, something else came into sight and dropped their hopes like stones to the bottom of the sea. It was another dinghy, broad as a tub, breasting the waves like a barge. The boy Bill sat at a chugging outboard motor in the stern, and Mr. Withers was leaning eagerly forward in front of him, his long dark hair blowing in the wind. He saw them and shouted with triumph, and then saw an unpleasant grin break on the boy's face as he turned the boat's nose towards the rocks in their path. They skidded to a halt, appalled. "Which way? They'll cut us off! We can't go back! Look, the others are going to land!" With the edge of the water creeping round their feet, they looked distractedly back and forth. Not 10 yards ahead, the boat with Mr. Withers evilly smiling was heading to cut off their path, and behind them the other dinghy was bobbing almost at the edge of the rocks. They were caught neatly in a trap. "Come over here," the deep voice called to them again. "You will not get away. Come here." Mr. Hastings was standing up in his dinghy, a tall black figure, one arm flung out towards them, with his legs planted apart to keep them balanced, swaying with the boat's rise and fall on the swell. He looked as if he were straddling the sea. "Barnabas," the voice dropped lower to a hypnotic monotone. "Barnabas, come here." Jane clutched at Barney's arm. "Don't go near him!" "No fear." Barney was frightened, but not bewitched into obedience as he had been before. "Oh, Simon, what can we do?" Simon stared up at the cliff, wondering for a wild moment if they could climb to safety, but the sheer granite face towered implacably up, far, far above their heads. They could never have found footholds there even to climb out of reach, and they would have fallen long before they reached the top. "Barnabas," the voice came again, gentle, insidious. "We know what it is you have in your hand, and you too, Simon. Oh, yes, Simon. Especially you." Simon and Barney each closed a hand instinctively tighter around the manuscript in the grail. "They're not yours." The voice rose more roughly. "You have no right to them. They must go back where they belong." Mr. Hastings was watching them intently, poised in the dinghy, waiting for the right moment of the swell to drop across to the rocks. Only the heaving mounds of seaweed masking the edge made him hesitate. At the tiller, Polly Withers was struggling to control the boat in the rising waves. Barney shouted suddenly, "You can't have them. They're not yours either. Why do you want them anyway? You haven't really got a museum. I don't believe all the things you said." Mr. Hastings laughed softly. The noise echoed eerily and spying chillingly over the gentle murmur of the sea. Yes. "You'll never win properly," Simon called defiantly. "You never do." "We shall this time," a lighter voice said behind them. They swung around again. It was Withers. The outboard motor had cut out, and quietly the other dinghy was edging toward them as the boy Bill groped over for the rock with an oar. They drew closer together with their backs against the cliff, pressed as far away as they could, but on either side the boats crept closer towards them. The Lady Mary was edging slowly along off the headland. They could hear her engines thrumming faintly, though they could see no one on board. "If only we had a boat," Jane said in despair. "Couldn't we swim for it?" "Where to? There must be something we can do." Barney's voice rose frantically. "There's nothing at all you can do," Withers' light, sneering voice came over the rocks to them. He was less than 5 yards away in the bow of the tossing dinghy. "Give us the manuscript. Give it to us, and we will take you off safely. The tide is rising very fast now. You must give it to us." "What if we don't?" Simon called rebelliously. "Look at the sea, Simon! You can't get back now the way you came. Look at the tide. You're cut off. You can't get away unless you come along with us." "He's right," Jane whispered. "Look!" She pointed. Further along the rocks, the sea was already washing the foot of the cliff. "Where's your boat, Simon?" called the mocking voice. "We'll have to give in," Simon said, low and angry. "We have to give in." "Take your time, Simon. We can wait. We've got all the time in the world." They heard the boys snicker on the other side of the boat. "They've got us. Oh, think, we can't give it up now. Think of Great Uncle Barry." "It's a pity we ever thought of him in the first place," Simon said fiercely. "It's no good. I'm going to say we give in." "No!" Barney said urgently, and before they realized what was happening, he had snatched the manuscript from Simon and splashed forward over the rocks to the edge of the sea. He held up the long, glinting case in one hand and the grail in the other and gazed furiously at Mr. Hastings. "If you don't pick us up and let us take them home, I shall throw them in the sea." "Barney!" Jane croaked, but Simon held her back, listening. Mr. Hastings did not move. He stood looking across with immense calm arrogance as Barney's small, bristling figure, and when he spoke, the deep voice was colder than any voice that he had ever heard. "If you do that, Barnabas, I shall leave you and your brother and sister here to drown." They had no doubt that he was speaking the truth, but Barney was carried away with a passionate indignation, and he was determined never again to believe that anything Mr. Hastings said. If once he did, he knew he would be under the spell again. I will! If you don't promise, I will!" He raised the grail higher in his right hand, flexing his muscles to throw it. Simon and Jane gasped. The whole world seemed to stop and center around the towering black-clad man and a small boy, one will against another, with Barney saved by his own fury from the full force of the commanding glare driving into his eyes. Then Mr. Hastings' face twisted, and he let out a strangled shout. "Withers!" And from that moment and for the children, the world cracked into unreality, and there seemed no reason in anything that happened. From either side, Norman, Withers, and Mr. Hastings made a dive for Barney. Simon shouted, "Barney, don't!" and dashed towards him to clasp his outstretched arm. Withers near made a great leap onto the rocks from his boat, setting it swaying wildly with Bill clinging frantically to the tiller. But as his lunging foot came down where the rock should have been, they saw the viciousness of his face change to alarm, and he flung up his arms and disappeared under the water. He had dropped down on the mast pool among the rocks, the gap where the retreating sea had left deep water, which now was filled far deeper by the incoming tide. Jane, cowering back against the cliff, chilled with horror as she realized that they would all three have gone headlong into it if they had run another yard further on. Withers surfaced again, coughing and spluttering, and Barney hesitated. The grail still held over his head. Mr. Hastings had leapt across to the rocks without falling, and was coming at him from the other side with long, loping strides, his dark brows a menacing bar across his face, and his lips drawn back in a horrible, unlaughing grin. Simon dived desperately, and was brushed aside by the sweep of one long arm, but in falling he grabbed the man's nearest leg and brought him crashing down full length on the wet, slippery rocks. For all his height, Mr. Hastings moved like an eel. In a moment he was on his feet again, with one big hand clasped around Simon's arm, and in a swift, cruel movement he pulled the arm round behind Simon's back and jerked it upward so that he cried out with pain. The girl in the boat laughed softly. She had not moved since the beginning. Jane heard and hated her, but soon transfixed by the look of concentrated evil cruelty on the face above her. It was as if something monstrous blazed behind Mr. Hastings' eyes. Something not human, that filled her with a horror more vast and dreadful than anything she had felt before. "Put it down, Barnabas," Mr. Hastings panted. "Put down the manuscript or I'll break his arm." Simon wriggled in his grasp and kicked backwards, and then gasped and went limp as his arm was jerked savagely higher and pain shot through him like a water boiling in his blood. But before Barney, his face twisted with concern, could even move, a great yell rang out over the water from the yacht. A rough voice shouted in anguished warning, "Master!" In the same morning and moment, they heard a new noise over the low throb of the yacht's waiting engines, a high-pitched drone that grew louder and nearer. Suddenly, round the corner of the headland from Thruisic, they saw a glittering arc of spray shot up from the bows of a big steamboat. It was moving tremendously fast, swinging around the seaward side of the yacht towards the place where they stood, and in a glimpse through the spray, they saw the only figure they knew that could tower as tall as Mr. Hastings, and above it the familiar blowing tussle of white hair. Jane let out a shout high with relief. "It's Gomery!" Mr. Hastings snarled and released Simon suddenly, making a desperate lunge forward at Barney, where he stood wavering on the edge. Just in time, Barney saw him and ducked away backwards under his hand. Bill, in his dinghy, ripped at the outboard motor and sent it roaring, then jumped, slithering on the rocks but landing safe. Chunky and menacing beside the giant height of the man in black, he faced them, crouching slightly, like dancers in a minuet. The two moved forward, groping slowly for the treacherous footholds, and the children shrank back against the cliff. The speedboat roared up in a great flurry of spray. Within seconds, it was alongside the headland. The engine's note changed to a deeper throb, and the boat lurched slowly closer. Looking fearfully over Bill's advancing shoulder, Jane could see Great Uncle Mary standing erect beside the blue-jerseyed figure of Mr. Penhallow, crouching over the controls. Forgetting everything in the overwhelming surge of relief, she dashed forward to the edge of the rocks, taking the boy by surprise, so they grasped her too late and overbalanced against Mr. Hastings. The man snarled at him angrily and made a last reach for Barney as he stood pressed and staring helplessly against the cliff, his arms hanging down now limp. But Simon, twisting up the last of his strength, snatched the grail in the long cylinder of the telescope case from his brother and slipped out of reach, dodging around him to the edge of the waves. He shouted urgently, "Gomery!" As his great-uncle turned, he raised his arm and flung the grail with all his might towards the speedboat, watching agonized to see if he could grasp and cross the gap. At the controls, Mr. Penhallow wrestled to hold the boat steady. The strange, bell-like cup wheeled through the air, flashing golden in the sun, and Great-Uncle Mary shot out one arm sideways like a slip fielder and caught it as if it curved out towards the water. "Look out!" Barney yelled. Mr. Hastings pivoted towards Simon as he drew back his arm to send the manuscript after the cup. Darting sideways to keep out of reach, he threw, but as the case left his hand, Mr. Withers, rising dripping to his feet in the dinghy, lunged out with an oar in a clumsy attempt to intercept it. Jane screamed! The oar struck the case in mid-flight. Withers let out a shout of triumph, but in his throat it changed to terror as the long, unwieldy case spun off the oar with the force of Simon's throw and came apart in the air. The two halves spiraled out away from the boat, scattering fragments of the familiar manuscript that they had studied so often. They saw the small lead case from the cave fall out and splash like a stone into the sea, and almost at the same moment the two halves of the telescope case, with their disintegrating parchment, hit the water and disappeared. The broken pieces of parchment did not float, they were gone at once, as if they had dissolved. Nothing was left but Jane's handkerchief bobbing forlornly on the waves. And then their blood stood still and cold within them, as an inhuman sound like the howl of an animal rang out over the sea. It was the second long howl that they had heard that day, but it was not the same as the first. Mr. Hastings put back his head like a dog and gave a great shriek of pain and fear and rage. With two long bounds, he leapt from the edge of the rocks and dived into a mighty splash into the rippled water where the case had gone down. They stared at the sunlight dancing on the water that had closed over his head, and but for the mutter of the engines in the sea, there was no sound, and a movement by the yacht caught their gaze, and they saw the girl being pulled aboard with her dinghy left bobbing below. Bill stood as immobile as the children, gazing open-mouthed at the sea turning golden now under the late sun. Then Withers shouted at him, lurching towards the outboard motor in the remaining dinghy. As the boat moved off, the boy flung himself abroad. The children still stood watching. No one moved either aboard the speedboat as it swayed towards the rocks on the swell. The dinghy moved out, buzzing like an angry wasp, and beside it they saw a dark head break the surface and heard the rasp of desperate, gulping breaths. The dinghy slowed. The man and the boy in it heaved the tall black figure aboard. It held nothing in its hand. Mr. Hastings lay in the bottom of the boat, choking and gasping for breath, but as they watched, he raised his head. The dark, wet hair flattened over his forehead like a mask, and put out a hand to Withers to pull himself up. With rage and hatred twisting his face, he looked back at Great Uncle Mary. Great Uncle Mary stood in the speedboat with one hand on the windshield and the other holding the grail, the sun behind him blazing in his white hair. He drew himself so tall and erect that he looked for a strange moment like some great creature of the rocks and the sea, and he called across the water in a strange voice that rang back from the cliff some words in a language that the children could not understand, but with a note through it that made them suddenly shiver. And the dark figure in the other boat seemed to shriek within himself at the sound, so that the menace and power were all at once gone out of him. Suddenly he looked only ridiculous in the skin-wet black clothes and seemed smaller than he had been before. All three in the boat cowered down, making no move or sound, as the dinghy crossed back to the yacht. The children stirred. "Gosh," Barney whispered. "What did he say?" "I don't know." "I'm glad I don't," Jane said slowly. They watched as the three figures swung themselves aboard the yacht, and almost at once the engine throbbed higher, and the Lady Mary's long white hull slipped away. The broad outboard dinghy trailed forlorn behind, but the other remained, bobbing and drifting empty on the waves. The yacht held out across the bay, passed through Essex Harbor, and down the coast until she was only a small white shape on the sun-gilded sea, and by the time they all climbed aboard the speedboat and looked again, she was gone. And that is where we will end for today. I thank you all so very much for joining me for that final chapter. We still have the epilogue to read, which I probably will squeeze in tomorrow morning. I love you all very, very, very much. Bye, y'all. Be good. Bye-bye.